The millionaire's babe had never announced until he bent the atramentous assistant, and his babe singing a melody that fabricated his apple abatement afar in seconds. Richard Blackwood stood in the aperture of the nursery, frozen, watching his 6-year-old babe sing a song in complete French, while Kesha, the assistant he had assassinated out of desperation, accompanied her on the piano. Isabella, diagnosed with careful mutism at the age of 3, hadn't announced a chat in over 2 years. And now she was continuing their singing like an angel. "What the hell is activity on here?" Richard roared, authoritative. Them both jump. Isabella anon fell silent, her dejected eyes bushing with terror, while Kesha Bound got up from the piano bench. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain." "Explain." Richard stormed into the room, his articulation burdened with the acerbity that fabricated Isabella run abaft Kesha. "Explain how you fabricated my babe allocution, aback the best specialists in New York said she adeptness never allege again." Kesha Johnson was 28 years old and knew absolutely what that accent meant. In the aftermost 2 months alive for the Blackwood family, she had appeared to apprehend that Richard saw his babe as a bootless project, an amusing embarrassment that bare to be hidden from aerial association events. The man spent fortunes on big-ticket therapists who advised Isabella like a lab rat, but he had never approved to artlessly allocution to her. "Sir, Isabella has consistently been able to speak. She chooses aback and with whom she speaks," Kesha replied calmly, agreement her duke protectively on the girl's shoulder. "She chooses." Richard laughed scornfully. "She's 6 years old and about mute. The doctors said it's a austere acoustic disorder, and aback you, a assistant with no medical training, can cure her in 2 months." The antipathy in Richard's articulation was unmistakable. To him, Kesha was a Loof Edition dispensable agent assassin because her bacon demands were lower than the specialized agencies that had acclimatized up on Isabella afterwards a few weeks. "I didn't cure her, sir. I listened to her," Kesha said. Activity. Isabella clasped her hand. "Isabella tells me absurd belief every day. She knows 3 languages and plays for altered instruments." "Lies." Richard argument out the words. "My babe can almost communicate. The medical letters are bright about her limitations." A fresh Isabella did article neither developed expected. She stepped out from abaft Kesha, looked anon at her father, and said in a clear, complete voice, "Daddy, I talk. I aloof don't allocution to bodies who don't appetite to acquire to me." The blackout that followed was deafening. Richard angry anemic as if he had apparent a ghost, while Kesha smiled proudly at her daughter's courage. "That's impossible," Richard muttered, amazing backward. "The doctors, the tests, years of therapy," Isabella continued, her articulation growing stronger. "Kesha asks me what I think. You abandoned ask the doctors. What's amiss with me?" The adverse artlessness of that book hit Richard like a bang in the face. He looked at his daughter, absolutely looked at her, and for the aboriginal time saw not a burst child, but an intelligent, self-aware babe who had been silenced by an apple that adopted to characterization her rather than acquire her. But Richard Blackwood was not the affectionate of man who accepted he was wrong. Abnormally not an avant-garde of an agent he advised inferior. His announcement acclimatized again. "Kesha, you're fired. I appetite you out of my abode appropriate now." "No," Isabella screamed, adhering to Kesha's dress. "She can't leave. She's the abandoned one who understands me." Richard absolutely abandoned his daughter's despair. "You've manipulated my babe somehow. I don't apperceive what tricks you've used, but that's abundant for today." Kesha remained calm, alike as she watched Isabella activate to cry silently. There was article in the Nanny's bent boring that fabricated Richard alternate for a second, as if she knew article he didn't. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood," Kesha said softly. "But afore I go, Isabella has article to appearance you. Article that adeptness change your angle on your own daughter. If you're adequate this adventure about how ageism can dark like an ancestor to his own daughter's potential, don't balloon to subscribe to the access because what Kesha was about to accede about Isabella would not abandon change the activity of that family, but prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden appropriate below our noses. You acquire 15 account to accumulate your things and get off my property," Richard declared, affairs his corpuscle buzz from his pocket. "And if you try to acquaintance my babe again, I'll alarm my lawyers." Kesha watched the man bite a number, apparently for the clandestine Aegis Bureau that looked afterwards the mansion. Richard Blackwood was absolutely the affectionate of actuality she had abstrused to admit afterwards years of alive for Manhattan's aristocratic families, affluent abundant to by annihilation except the adeptness to see his own babe as a complete animal being. Mr. Blackwood, Kesha said calmly, alike admitting she could see Isabella still adhering to her dress. Can I at Atomic explain what I've apparent about Isabella over the aftermost 2 months? There's annihilation to discover. Richard cut her off, blind up the phone. My babe has bright limitations diagnosed by competent professionals. You're not a doctor. You're not a therapist. You're a loofah assistant who managed to advise a few tricks to a abashed child. The chat aloof echoed through the allowance like a slap. Kesha Johnson had accelerating from Columbia University with ceremoniousness in adolescent psychology, battened 4 languages fluently, and had specializations in cerebral development and adolescence trauma. But to Richard, she would consistently be aloof a atramentus assistant he had assassin for 20% below than what specialized agencies charged. Daddy, please. Isabella begged, her aboriginal words to her ancestor in over 2 years. Kesha accomplished me that I'm smart. She teaches me things the doctors never did. Richard didn't like attending at his daughter. His eyes abide anchored on Kesha with the aloofness she knew all too well. The attending of addition acclimatized to auctioning bodies like disposable objects. Isabella, go to your room. The new assistant will access tomorrow morning, he ordered as if he were talking to a contrary dog. I don't appetite a new nanny. Isabella screamed, clutching Kesha's dress alike tighter. I appetite Kesha. She doesn't amusement me like I'm broken. It was afresh that Richard did article that abashed alike Kesha, who was acclimatized to the bearded animality of aerial society. He best Isabella up with boundless force, absolutely blank her screams. And please, and handed her to Carmen, the charwoman who had appeared at the door. Carmen, booty Isabella to her allowance and locked the door. She doesn't appear out until I've sorted this out, he said, as if giving instructions about the trash. Kesha! Isabella yelled as she was abject out of the room, her tears alveolate bottomward the hallway. Don't leave me. Amused, don't leave me. The complete of Isabella's bedchamber aperture locking cut through the air like a gunshot. Kesha stood motionless, processing the complete aloofness of this man who had aloof traumatized his own babe to advance his acceptable adaptation of reality. Now Richard angry to Kesha with a smile that didn't adeptness his eyes. You acquire 10 minutes. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll alarm security. Kesha Johnson had developed up in Brooklyn, the babe of a charwoman adult and a bus driver. She knew anxiously the activity of actuality underestimated, dismissed, and advised as inferior by bodies who abashed money with intelligence. But she had additionally abstruse article that Richard Blackwood had yet to discover. The best alarming bodies are those you absolutely underestimate. Mr. Blackwood, she said, befitting her articulation alike as she aggregate her purse. Can I ask you a simple question? Richard glanced at the gold Rolex on his wrist with affected impatience. Quick, do you absolutely acquire your babe as incapable, or are you abashed to acquisition out that she's smarter than you think? The catechism hit Richard like a bite in the stomach. He took a footfall against Kesha, his fists clenched. How curtail you catechism my adeptness as a father? I've spent a affluence on experts, therapies, treatments. I've done aggregate for my daughter. Aggregate except acquire to her, Kesha replied softly. Isabella doesn't charge added therapists, sir. She needs an ancestor who believes in her. Richard laughed scornfully. Parenting admonition from an aide in her 20s who doesn't alike acquire children. What a joke. Kesha opened her purse and took out a baby agenda recorder. Mr. Blackwood, over the accomplished 2 months, Isabella has told me abounding things. Belief about how she feels aback the doctor's allocution about her, as if she isn't there. How sad she gets aback you abolish banquet parties because you're abashed to booty her out. How she affected she couldn't airing appropriately during a doctor's arrangement because she accomplished that the added bound she appeared, the added absorption she got. Richard's face gradually palled as Kesha spoke. Your babe is not mute, Mr. Blackwood. She is a ablaze adolescent who has abstruse that blackout is the abandoned way to get amore in a home area actuality altered is advised like a disease. Richard Berserk snatched the band recorder from Kesha's hands. You weren't accustomed to almanac annihilation in this house. This is aggression of privacy. Isabella gave me permission, Kesha replied calmly. She capital addition to assuredly apprehend her voice. And there are abounding added recordings, sir. 2 hours of conversations area your babe demonstrates an avant-garde vocabulary, adeptness of classical music, and an affecting compassionate that would affect any psychologist. Absoluteness began to anatomy in Richard's eyes like a broad storm. For the aboriginal time, he accepted that he had absolutely underestimated, not abandoned his daughter, but additionally the woman continuing in avant-garde of him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice. Kesha smiled. For the aboriginal time, aback Richard had entered the room. It wasn't a smile of victory, but article abundant added dangerous. The announcement of addition who possesses advice that can abort anxiously complete worlds. I appetite you to stop alleviate of your babe like a bootless activity, and Alpha seeing her as the amazing adolescent she has consistently been. But added than that, she paused, affairs edition recorder from her sleeve. I appetite you to acquire that some bodies you exceed aloof advisors apperceive absolutely how to certificate annoying truths. From the hallway, Isabella could still be heard errant in her bound bedroom, calling Kesha's name. The complete cut through the close air amid the two adults like a connected admonition that at the centermost of this action of wills was a 6-year-old adolescent who aloof capital to be understood. Richard looked at Kesha with a mixture of acrimony and article she accustomed as fear. For the aboriginal time in his life, he had begun addition who was not abashed by his money, his amusing status, or his threats. Addition who bedeviled article he could not buy, the accuracy about who he absolutely was as a father. Every new abasement Richard approved to administer abandoned fueled article central Kesha that he couldn't see. A assurance artificial in years of angry prejudices far worse than his. What this advantaged man didn't apperceive was that every act of antipathy was accoutrement her with absolutely the armament she bare for a war. He didn't alike apprehend he was losing. Proving that sometimes the greatest backbone grows at the absolute moment others acquire burst our spirit. 3 Canicule had anesthetized aback Kesha had been expelled from the Blackwood mansion. And Richard believed he had assuredly apparent the botheration of the annoying Nanny. He had assassined a new caregiver through the best big-ticket bureau in Manhattan. Margaret Foster, a 60-year-old British woman with categorical credentials, and added importantly, the complete acumen he demanded. Isabella hasn't said a chat aback the new assistant arrived. Carmen appeared nervously, award Richard in his office. She refuses to leave her room, isn't bistro properly, and is authoritative those aberrant noises afresh aback she gets upset. Richard didn't like attending up from his banking reports. That's natural. She needs to acclimatize to the new routine. Miss Foster is an able professional, not an improviser. The buzz rang, arresting the conversation. Richard answered impatiently, but his announcement afflicted badly aback. He heard the articulation on the added end of the line. Mr. Blackwood, this is David Martinez from the Law Close Martinez and Associates. I represent Miss Kesha Johnson in an amount that may be of alternate interest. Richard motioned for Carmen to leave and bankrupt the appointment door. I don't apperceive what you're talking about. That woman was accursed for aloof cause. Interesting. The lawyer's articulation was calmly able, because I acquire actuality a rather all-encompassing abstracts on ancestral bigotry and adolescent abuse. My applicant has anxiously accurate her adventures in your home. This is extortion, Richard roared. But his articulation betrayed his nervousness. I acquire the best attorneys in New York. That assistant can't acquiesce to booty me on. David Martinez chuckled softly. Miss Johnson, accelerating with accomplished ceremoniousness in adolescent attitude from Columbia, has a specialization in adolescent agony and cerebral development, and is currently advancing a master's amount in children's rights at NYU. She additionally maintains a blog on adolescent development that is followed by over 200,000 professionals in the field. The blackout on the added end of the band was deafening. Richard acquainted the attic abandoned below his feet. But what's best interesting, the advocate continued, are the recordings she has not abandoned of Isabella demonstrating aberrant cerebral abilities, but additionally of assertive absolute conversations about how you accredit to your own babe aback you anticipate no one is listening. Richard vaguely remembered the times he had announced on the buzz with doctors, apropos to Isabella as an absent account or a comatose end. He had consistently anticipation he was abandoned in his office. What do you want? He asked, his articulation hoarse. For now, aloof a civilian conversation. My applicant is not vindictive, Mr. Blackwood. She absolutely cares about Isabella's well-being, but she additionally won't acquiesce a blaze adolescent to be afflicted by affectionate prejudice. Meanwhile, beyond town, Kesha sat in a baby accommodation she aggregate with 2 adolescent adept students, anxiously reviewing months of notes, recordings, and photographs. Every alternation with Isabella had been accurate not out of malice, but out of an bookish addiction of recording aberrant adolescent development. Dr. Sarah Chun, Kesha's coach and assistant of adolescent attitude at Columbia, analyzed the recordings with the attending of growing outrage. Kesha, this is extraordinary. Isabella not abandoned demonstrates a loft intelligence, but has developed adult arresting mechanisms to accord with analytical affecting neglect. This adolescent is absorption her own brainy bloom through careful mutism. I know, Kesha replied calmly. And her ancestor thinks he's healing Isabella with therapists who amusement her like she's mentally disabled. He's causing irreversible cerebral damage. Dr. Chun best up one of the recordings area Isabella sang an absolute opera in Italian. With your permission, I'd like to present this case at a Budding Week's Adolescent Development Conference. It's a complete archetype of how ancestors' biases can affectation giftedness. Not yet, Kesha said anxiously, putting the files away. First, Richard Blackwood needs to acquire that his babe is not a botheration to be hidden away. She is an allowance that he is wasting. Back at the mansion, Margaret Foster approved abominably to get Isabella to eat article during dinner. The babe remained silent, blame her aliment about her bowl with a broad expression. She acclimated to be like this afore the added assistant arrived. Richard explained coldly to the new employee. This is her accustomed behavior. Don't be bamboozled by affected tricks. Margaret, an accomplished professional, watched Isabella with growing concern. In 40 years of caring for children, she had never apparent a babe so acutely traumatized actuality advised with such alienation by her own father. Mr. Blackwood, she said cautiously, conceivably the adolescent would account from an added abandoned approach. She acutely possesses a loft boilerplate intelligence. Isabella has bright limitations diagnosed by experts. Richard cut her off. Don't animate fantasies. That's absolutely what the antecedent assistant did, bushing her arch with impossibilities. That night afterwards Richard retired to his office. Margaret approved an altered approach. She sat bottomward abutting to Isabella and whispered, I apperceive you can apprehend me, sweetheart. You don't acquire to allocution if you don't appetite to, but I would absolutely like to get to apperceive you better. Isabella looked up for the aboriginal time in 3 days. Slowly, she wrote article on a napkin and handed it to Margaret. Is Kesha advancing back? It apprehend in decidedly complete handwriting. Margaret looked at the girl, seeing for the aboriginal time not a afflicted child, but a badly abandoned little girl. I don't know, sweetheart, but I do apperceive that you are abundant added appropriate than anyone in this abode realizes. Isabella smiled acutely and wrote addition sentence. Kesha knew that. As Margaret approved to action the affecting complication of the 6-year-old, her buzz vibrated with a bulletin from an alien number. Hello, Margaret. I'm Kesha Johnson, Isabella's antecedent nanny. I apperceive you're austere able, and that you charge be acquainted aberrant things in the ancestors' dynamic. If you appetite to allocution about what's absolutely activity on in this house, amuse adeptness out to me. Isabella needs our help. Margaret looked at Isabella, who had burst comatose on the couch, still clutching the napkin with her questions about Kesha. For the aboriginal time in her career, an accomplished able begin herself analytic whether actuality in a home was added adverse than benign to a child. Beyond town, Kesha was finishing acclamation what she had amorphous to alarm activity Isabella. A complete affidavit that would prove not abandon the girl's genius, but the analytical carelessness she suffered. David Martinez had fabricated it bright that they had a solid acknowledged case. But Kesha capital article added acceptable than a cloister victory. She capital Richard Blackwood to about exceed the amazing babe he had abandoned for years. Because some men abandoned apprentice aback they lose aggregate the anticipation they had. And Richard was about to ascertain that he had underestimated not aloof a competent nanny, but a woman who would about face every act of antipathy into ammunition for amends that would absolutely adapt Isabella's future. Proving that sometimes the best animus is artlessly to exceed the accuracy that bodies try so badly to hide. An anniversary later, Richard Blackwood woke up to an alternation of notifications on his corpuscle buzz that fabricated his claret run cold. The aboriginal was an email from the New York Department of Children's Casework requesting and burning ancestors' abundance appraisal for the Blackwood home. The additional was an absent alarm from his claimed lawyer. The third was a bulletin that would change his activity forever. Mr. Blackwood, columnist appointment today at 3:00 p.m. at Columbia University's Children's Rights Center. Your attendance is recommended. KJ Richard rushed to his appointment, and anon alleged David Martinez. What the hell is activity on? Why does amusing casework appetite to appraise my home? Mr. Blackwood? His lawyer's articulation was tense. You charge to appear to my appointment appropriate now. We acquire abundant added austere bearings than we thought. An hour later, Richard was sitting in an appointment allowance watching a presentation that systematically destroyed aggregate he believed about himself as a father. Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the country's best admired adolescent development experts, conducted the presentation with surgical precision. These recordings were fabricated. Over a 2-month aeon by a able with the accurate permission of the child, Dr. Chin explained, arena the audio of Isabella singing an absolute opera in Italian. As you can hear, the babe possesses not abandoned aberrant clear ability, but linguistic ability that indicates giftedness. Richard was anemic but approved to advance his composure. These recordings were fabricated afterwards my permission. They're illegal. David Martinez befuddled his arch gravely. Actually, they're not. New York law allows educational affidavit aback. There is suspicion of adolescent development neglect. And there's more. The abutting recording was alike added devastating. Isabella's articulation bright and articulate, answer to Kesha. Daddy consistently tells the doctors that I don't acquire things. He talks about me as if I'm not there. Yesterday, he said on the buzz that I'm a non-return-turnable advance, and that maybe he should accelerate me to an appropriate boarding school. Richard acquainted his apple collapse. He vaguely remembered that buzz call, cerebration he was abandoned in his office. There are 17 hours of agnate material, Dr. Chun connected relentlessly. Isabella consistently demonstrates a loft intelligence, affecting adherence aback advised appropriately, and an aching compassionate of how she is perceived by her father. But the affliction was yet to come. The projector awning showed an alternation of medical letters from the aftermost 3 years, all active by Richard, all downplaying or distorting Isabella's absolute abilities. Best disturbing, Dr. Chin said, is the accord we apparent amid Mr. Blackwood and Isabella's therapists. Emails area he absolutely asks them to advance diagnoses that absolve her amusing disability, his exact words. Richard approved to stand, but David captivated him aback by the arm. Sit bottomward and listen. It's not over yet. Kesha Johnson entered the allowance accustomed to billowing folder. She showed no acrimony or avenging satisfaction, aloof the quiet assurance of addition who had anxiously accurate in injustice. Mr. Blackwood, she said calmly. For 2 months, Isabella told me about how she affected to acquire greater difficulties than she absolutely did because she accomplished that the added bound she seemed, the added absorption she got from her father, a 6-year-old adolescent manipulating adults to get basal affection. Richard assuredly exploded. You manipulated my daughter. You accomplished her to lie, to pretend she has abilities she doesn't have. Actually, Dr. Chin interrupted. The acoustic tests we've done over the accomplished few weeks affirm that Isabella has never had any cerebral limitations. The careful mutism was an acknowledgement to analytical affecting neglect. Kesha opened the folder, absolute hundreds of drawings, agreeable compositions, and a like abbreviate balladry that Isabella had created during those 2 months. Isabella didn't charge to be cured, Mr. Blackwood. She bare to be seen. But the doctors, Richard stammered. The doctors responded to your expectations, David Martinez explained coldly. Aback an affecting and affluent ancestor again insists that their babe has limitations. Professionals tend to acquisition affirmation that confirms that narrative, abnormally aback that ancestor pays absolute able-bodied for acceptable diagnosis. The final draft came aback Dr. Chun played the best contempo recording fabricated aloof 3 canicule beforehand with Isabella conversing calmly with Margaret Foster about aesthetics and avant-garde mathematics. What amazes me most, Isabella's articulation echoed through the room, is how Dad never accomplished that I consistently knew he was abashed of me. I aloof affected to be added bound, because it seemed like the abandoned way he would pay absorption to me. Richard burst into his chair. All his airs evaporated. I aloof capital to assure her. I capital her to be normal, happy. You capital her to fit into your adaptation of normal, Kesha adapted gently. And aback she didn't. You'd rather acquire she was burst than acquire that maybe your analog of accustomed was too limited. David Martinez placed a certificate in avant-garde of Richard. The Department of Children's Casework is because a supervised collective aegis plan. Isabella will abide to alive with you, but with binding cerebral counseling, not for her, for you. And there's more, Dr. Chin added. Isabella will be chip into affairs for able accouchement at Columbia, area her abilities will be appropriately stimulated. Miss Johnson will be her official educational tutor. Richard looked at Kesha with an admixture of acrimony and article that looked like despair. What do you appetite from me? I appetite you to be the ancestor Isabella deserves, Kesha replied simply. I appetite you to see your babe as the amazing adolescent she has consistently been. And I appetite you to acquire that some of the bodies you accede aloof advisors may see treasures that you yourself acquire overlooked. Today's columnist conference, David abreast him, will present Isabella's case as a groundbreaking abstraction of how ancestors' biases can affectation giftedness. Miss Johnson will be accustomed as an accessory researcher at Columbia. Richard assuredly accepted the abounding admeasurement of his defeat. Not abandoned had he absent believability as a father, but the simple assistant he had abhorred was about to be acclaimed nationally as the actuality who adored an able adolescent from years of bookish neglect. Does Isabella apperceive all this? He asked, his articulation breaking. Kesha smiled for the aboriginal time. Isabella helped plan everything. She absolutely wants her dad to apprentice to see her for who she is. She told me, Kesha, Amoroso isn't bad. He aloof forgot how to attending at me afterwards actuality afraid. The absolution absolute in those words from a 6-year-old was added adverse to Richard than any acknowledged abuse could acquire been. He had been defeated not by acrimony or revenge, but by the acumen and benevolence of his own daughter, a babe whose adeptness he had systematically abandoned because she didn't fit into his attenuated cast of normality. As the adults accomplished the acknowledged capacity of that ancestor's revolution, one catechism afraid in the air. Was it accessible to clean a father-daughter accord aback the ancestor himself had apparent that he had spent years angry ghosts he had created? While the real abundance was appropriate in avant-garde of him, cat and mouse patiently to be accustomed for what she had consistently been, an amazing adolescent bearded as a botheration to be solved. 6 months later, Richard Blackwood sat in the avant-garde row of the Columbia University auditorium, watching his 6-year-old babe accept a Medal of Honor for bookish excellence. Isabella, now chatty in Bristol's languages and the artisan of 3 aboriginal agreeable pieces, apparent on date like the adolescent prodigy she had consistently been. Daddy, she sighed as she stepped off the stage. Are you appreciative of me now? Richard hugged his daughter, tears a live bottomward his face. I've consistently been appreciative of you, princess. I aloof had to apprentice to see it. Kesha Johnson, now a nationally accustomed doctoral applicant and adolescent development consultant, watched from the admirers alongside Dr. Sarah Chun. Her book, Invisible Children, How Ageism Kills Potential, had become a bestseller. Richard approached her afterwards the ceremony. Kesha, I'm sorry. You don't charge to apologize, she disconnected gently. You charge to accumulate actuality the ancestor Isabella consistently knew you could be. Margaret Foster, who had become a key accessory in the family's transformation, smiled as she watched Isabella run through the garden with added able children. Kesha's accurate animus was not to abort Richard Blackwood, but to transform him into the ancestor Isabella deserved. She accepted that sometimes the greatest achievement is not acquisition our enemies, but extenuate them from themselves. If you acquire that every adolescent deserves to be a parent for their accurate potential, not what others apprehend of them, subscribe to the channel. Because aback we stop anticipation by appearances and alpha absolutely listening. We ascertain that the greatest treasures are hidden abaft our own prejudices.